Hello.
Hello there.
I'm just checking in to say hi.
Good. Glad to see you. Thanks for logging in. I'm Keith. Good to meet you. Obviously,
Hold on, let me put
your sound and video look good, so we're in good shape there.
Okay, now I have the headphones on.
Okay. Yeah, everything looks good from this end, so I think you're ready to go.
Okay.
Did you have any questions?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I usually can't tell until right in the middle of it.
Exactly. That's how it works.
That I had a question. So
yeah.
I'm gonna leave you on, but I'm gonna listen to the
That's fine.
John Lewis funeral. Okay. I'll turn the camera off, but as soon as you say I have these in so I can hear you.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Do-do-do. There it is. There's a long delay there. So, need it. Okay, Dr. Melody's on. Where about that one go? Hello. But where did it go? I swear I had it over here and I tossed it. Let me see how my looks here. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. Andrea, you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I got you in the right spot then.
Hey, Andrea.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing all right.
Well, this is someday, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah, I'm told him I hear y'all, but I'm listening to the.
I think I need to turn off my television for sure. I know we're live streaming, but anybody paying any attention right now, you all understand. This is
Right.
this is not a normal moment in time.
Right.
See if I have any messages from others. Hello, Dr. Cooper.
Hey, I'm sorry I'm late. I just missed that you wanted us to log in a few minutes early, so I apologize.
It is perfectly fine. We are, I call it we already weren't normal, not normal days. And hopefully we'll have Dr. Hendricks somewhere time soon.
Hey, Brittany.
Hey, how you?
Hello, Leslie Copeland Toon, who I've heard a lot about but never met before.
Same.
How do you do?
Can you hear Leslie? She's kind of just looking.
No, she's just
frozen.
stuck. Yeah,
I think
she's
she's
frozen.
frozen.
Oh,
on my
she's
screen.
frozen.
Hey.
Such is the world of, again, of the electronics and COVID.
That's right. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, she's moving now.
Hey, it's good to see everybody. I'm so glad you all are doing this. Today is like the perfect day, it feels like, to be talking about this. So
I think it is, yeah. And like I said, we want to have a conversation, but this is a way this is one of those things that as I'm looking at all the church girls and everybody, we're going to be like, we're just going to let the Spirit kind of let us be, because I think there's a lot to be said about where we are right now.
So much.
It's changing as we do and be. Let me try to contact Dr. Hendricks to see.
he's probably watching. You know what he's doing. He's watching eulogy.
I just pressed record on my TV.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly where we are. I'm doing the same thing.
And I couldn't really watch it because I mean, I keep going through this thing where I'm wondering if there's such time in life where you actually run out of tears.
Yeah.
I have been since he died, really, honestly, I've had so many moments, but today reading that letter just took me over the edge.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
same. I was crying real tears this morning.
Oh my goodness.
Oh no.
I mean,
Yeah.
I just feel like it was an act of love, for him to like spend his last moments. Like, I want to make sure they have, these parting instructions and encouragement.
Yeah. I mean, it's so loving and thoughtful. It reminds me of the lore around Harriet Tubman that, her final words were, "I go to prepare a place for you."
Oh yeah.
Right.
And I just thought, y'all gonna take us up out of here with this. Like, oh my God, like I just can't.
I'm like,
Obama quoted 2 Corinthians
yeah.
just now. I'm still into him. That's why I'm sort of late.
What I was gonna say, Dr. Hendricks comes in with the sermon.
Yes. That's the last thing I heard was that.
What was
I am troubled, but not,
Oh, yeah.
Pressed down, but not destroyed. Yeah.
not destroyed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lord.
He's doing quite well on this here film.
I mean, he has his moments for sure.
Yeah.
He got a lot of moments now. I gotta give him credit. He knows how to bring it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
That's the part. Yeah, I'm like, and where did you learn that? From 20 years of sitting up under Jeremiah Wright. And how did that work out for Brother Wright? But that's fine. We don't have to talk about that today.
Oh, here comes Brittany.
I'm like, well, are we gonna give him credit for being in the Black church tradition when he runs for office by basically disavowing the person who helped him be able to do that shit? He couldn't do that before he arrived at Trinity. Anyway,
I see this thing that says live on YouTube. Does that mean that they can actually see us?
Right now?
Yeah, can they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they can see you. And people are
I
logging
didn't know
on to
we
Zoom.
had gone live yet, but that's fine.
So,
I
please
noticed it when I
strike
looked
everything that has been said.
Yes, now people are responding in the chat. Yes, well, I was like, I try to not cuss so bad on the church events. I try to pretend to be a decent church girl, but
I was about to go
works out
in,
for
but
me.
then I looked up and saw that live, and I was like, wait a minute, live where? Like,
Glad you saw it.
It's live around the World Wide
Stop
Web.
trying to be a Peter type Christian today and not cuss so bad. It might not work out though.
So I am going to start to shape it to make it seem like we're going to be a little more formal, and then I'm going to let us all go. Yeah.
Even though people are watching us right now.
Right. First of all, I really do want to welcome everyone, and as you can see, this is an amazing. These are some amazing thought leaders that are going to be with us today, but they also happen to be good friends. And we really did want to shape this as a conversation. So given the moment that we're in right now, again, we want to welcome people. Hello.
Hello.
On behalf of the National Council of Churches of Christ, I do welcome you. I am Reverend Andrea Alexander. I serve as the Associate General Secretary for Action and Advocacy for Justice and Peace. And in that capacity, one of my responsibilities is addressing and dealing with the issue of race and our Act Now to End Racism campaign. I'm going to apologize, everybody, because I've been working on this whole lighting thing because I don't have the studio in my home as of yet. Thank you.
Need the ring light.
Yes. Should be putting a ring light probably. And so today we're going to be talking about something I think is very interesting. And I'll do a little more about how we came to this subject today, but who lives and who dies? How the coronavirus pandemic has shined a light on the politics of death in the United States. But then we come here today as a beloved warrior of justice is being laid to rest, and we as a nation are bidding our final farewell as he joins that great cloud of witnesses and takes his place among the ancestors. So before we get started, I will ask my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland-Toon, if she would open us in a word of prayer.
Thank you. Let us pray, everyone. Gracious God, we come before you grateful for this day, grateful God for this moment to gather together. Grateful God that we know that you have called us your children and that we are your very own, that we have value, we have worth, we have purpose, oh God. And so we're grateful for this gathering, for this conversation about our value and how we can let that be manifest in our culture, in our society, especially at such a time as this. We give thanks, oh God, today for John Robert Lewis, and even for the parting words that he left us, the instructions, the encouragement, oh God. Let us carry on the torch that he has lit for us, oh God. Let our words and actions be manifest in this world, that we no longer have to have a conversation about every life being valued and valuable, but that we actually live it out in our world. God, we thank you. We bless you for each and every panelist, for the gifts that they have. God, we give you thanks. We ask that you would lead us and guide us in this conversation and be with us, and let this conversation be the beginning, oh God, of us moving to the next level, moving to the next steps of what it means to end racism in our society, in our culture, in our churches. Let this be the beginning, oh God. Let seeds that have already been planted be manifest, oh God, and let this conversation be a part of those seeds being watered. And God, we know that you will eventually give the increase. We entrust it to you even now. It's in your matchless name that we pray and ask these things. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
So I'm going to do a very brief overview, actually a brief introduction, because I want us to have as much time as possible for this conversation. And I appreciate actually being in this time and space, because I think that among a whole lot of other people, there are others that I would also enjoy being with. The three of you, oh my God, I mean, we could just go off somewhere and put right now this whole idea of understanding of the social political concept of determining who lives and who dies under a necropolitics kind of a understanding, and juxtaposition with the life and legacy of a John Lewis, and all of those. So for our audience, again, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to this conversation. We have with us today, and again, I'm going to give brief overviews because this group of people, they are so, is the word will be Googleable. You go in and find all of their books and their writings and the awards. I mean, a phenomenal panel. But we have Dr. Brittany Cooper, who is now an associate professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and Africana studies at Rutgers University. Dr. Melanie Price is the endowed professor of political science and principal investigator for the Mellon Foundation African American Studies Initiative at Prairie View A&M University in Houston, Texas, where I happen to have a niece there who I keep telling her go and visit Dr. Price, and I think she's afraid. Anyway, Dr. Price's research and areas of expertise include Black politics, public opinion, political rhetoric, and social movements. And then we have the Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks Jr., distinguished senior fellow at the Democracy Collaborative in Washington, D.C. Dr. Hendricks has been called one of the most provocative and innovative commentators on the intersection of religion, politics, and social policy in America today. I'm like, woo, all of that right here. So how did we get here? A few months ago, I want to say maybe April or it might have even still been in March, but somewhere early for us as in the United States, beginning to kind of understand and see the impact of COVID-19. And Dr. Brittany Cooper was on AM Joy, and she threw out a term and began to expound upon it. And she started talking about this social political power of determining who lives and who dies under this concept of necropolitics. And if I'm mispronouncing it, y'all will fix it for me. Because it was new for me, and I'm pleased to know that Joy Reid was also not aware. And she said herself, wait a minute, I have not had people come on here usually and say something that makes me have to look it up and study it. I actually myself paused the television and went and got a pen and paper. Because what I was hearing is Dr. Cooper was speaking is that I knew that there was this concept where we talk about whether or not life has value. The whole Black Lives Matters ethos comes from this whole idea that somehow there's an understanding that our lives do not matter. But there's also this way that when we talk about that, we're actually talking about mostly about living, but to think that there is actually this philosophy that actually has a hierarchy of value that says who is expendable for death. And so that is what led me to, and it began to just like, swirl around in my head, and I'm looking at my paper because I want to pronounce correctly. The political scientists who kind of conceptualized the idea, Achille Mbembe, and I ordered his book, the essay on the issue, and then I began to, I went to law school. I practiced law, and I've always been intrigued by the fact that people talk about disparate impact with laws. And the reality is I was like, no, it's really intended to be that way. And over time, at first it was real specific. Like Lee Atwater said, and I'm gonna say this, and I'm only quoting, when he said, you at first you could say nigger, 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 but you can't do that anymore. So you start saying disparate impact. And so there's policies and procedures and things that are being implemented that are intended to have the impact. And then he says, you don't have to say it anymore because the desired impact will happen and people won't acknowledge it, because instead you're saying things like urban blight and these things. So I'm not going to keep going with that right now. I just wanted to kind of bring that out as to how we came to have this conversation. And this was before the lynching of George Floyd. And so it just kind of built upon it. And it was really just in my head. And I contacted Dr. Cooper and said, would you be willing to have a conversation about this? And I asked our office, Reverend Dr. Copeland Toon, our Chief Operating Officer, and our General Secretary, Dr. Jim Winkler, and I was like, I really want us to do this. And then I thought, who should be in this conversation? And the other two people who are currently with us were the very first minds. Your mind and what you would offer were those that came to mind. So Dr. Cooper, would you mind opening us up and kind of expounding upon what I've messed up in the way of trying to articulate what this theory is? And then we will, I mentioned to you all that I want this to be a conversation for our those who are engaged with us. If you have questions, feel free to post them in our Q&A section, and we will try to gather questions along the way. So thank you, Dr. Cooper.
So thank you, Reverend Alexander, and thank you, Reverend Dr. Copeland Toon, and my illustrious and esteemed colleagues. It's a pleasure to chop it up with you guys. So I want to begin by framing what I mean by necropolitics, but I want to frame that in a larger conversation that I have whenever I'm in a church context in this moment, as a church girl, about part of the challenge that I think we have in the church, which is, because I grew up, I'm a Baptist church girl, so there's alliteration involved. So I'm just setting it up to say, I think that I like these three kind of concepts that begin with N. So in the church right now, I think we have a challenge of necropolitics. I think we have a challenge of neoliberalism. And I think that that's happening in an age where nihilism is rife and rampant. So what do I mean by that? So necropolitics is, as Reverend Alexander said, a term coined by a South African political theorist named Achille Mbembe. And he was reacting to the work of a postmodernist philosopher named Michel Foucault. So Michel Foucault talked about what he termed biopolitics. And biopolitics is essentially the way that governments, through their governing structures, their policies, and their procedures, participate in engaging in what essentially amounts to a kind of population control, right? By determining that certain populations have more value than other populations. And so Michel Foucault basically argued that governments essentially have a practice of making some groups live while letting other groups languish and die. And so we think about that, and we think about housing policy in this country, or we think about mass incarceration, or we think about schooling. What are the kinds of structures that help people to live and thrive? But Achille Mbembe coming up in the South African context says, look, you're a little too kind and a little too passive when we talk about oppressed peoples and the ways that governing structures work. So it's not merely that they let these other groups languish and die. Let is too passive a term. They let certain groups live or make certain groups live, but they also actively participate in making other groups die through acts of oppression, like a terrible healthcare system that can't get to the least of these, by the police actually targeting and killing unarmed citizens, by undereducating people and then putting them in an incarceration or poverty pipeline so that they then begin to have disparate impacts in terms of health, by redlining communities and making it so that people live in food deserts, which then has health outcomes over time. And then certainly the things that we're learning about the way that racial stress impacts the body, so that it ages Black bodies more quickly than other bodies age, creates problems of inflammation, which many health practitioners think are the roots of so many of the like comorbidities that we have that has made the COVID crisis so devastating to our communities. And just to put that in context, as of July the 21st, 1 in every 1,350 Black people that exist in the country had passed away from COVID. 1 in every 1,350 Black people has passed away. That means total population, not 1 in every 1,350 Blacks that gets the virus, but 1 in every 1,350 Blacks that exist. To give it to you in racial comparison, 1 in every 3,100 whites has passed away. So we're literally dying somewhere between 2 times and almost 4 times the rate, depending on if you control for age. And 2 weeks ago, when the death numbers in total were 141,000 and not where we are today at 151,000, 30,000 Black people, 29,946 Black people had died. That was 2 weeks ago. And what the number suggests is that if we had died at the rates that white people were dying of this disease, 17,000 Black people would still be alive. So our comorbidities, our vulnerability to disease means that we are dying at higher rates, and it means that we are, dying in ways that, but for comorbidities and stress. So if this crisis had been handled, 30,000 Black people would still be here. Even if we had had this level of crisis, if we didn't have the health challenges that we had brought on by prolonged histories of racial stress, 17,000 less Black people would actually be here. And I think we have to sit with those numbers, because for us, it's hard to conceptualize 151,000 people being dead. But even if we look at the smaller numbers in our own racial group as Black folks, it's massive. So the scholar Ruth Gilmore says that one way to describe racism is that it is a propensity for, or a vulnerability to premature death. That it is the way that systems set us up to die before our time because of all of these systems that impact us. And she says that is actually a core definition of racism. And so all of that fits with what Mbembe calls necropolitics, this politics, as Reverend Alexander put it, of who lives and who dies. And so how does that then show up when we're talking about COVID? Well, that's where you get to this second end that I'm talking about, which is this idea of neoliberalism. So the thing that made me begin to connect necropolitics to this moment was that Trump got on camera in April and early May, and started talking about reopening the country as tens of thousands of people were dying all over the country. But that's the moment when we began to recognize the severe racial disparities. And at the point that the conversation became about how so many Black people were dying, then the right shifted its political discourse to a discourse of premature reopening the country, right? Which also means premature death for Black people and for any people who become susceptible to this thing. And all of that is rooted in a neoliberal impulse that says that profits matter more than people, and that it actually matters more for folks to be working than it matters to protect life. And you see this sort of more marching away from a kind of morality that it's clear that our job is in this moment to protect life first. And certainly that's interesting from the pro-life party, right? That they don't want to protect life first, that they want to protect profits first. And that is the, like, if we had to give neoliberalism a tagline, that's what it would be. And so then when you think about what that means in the age of nihilism, well, nihilism can mean a couple of things. It means we just don't care, but it can also mean, as certain scholars have argued in Black communities, that it hurts too much to care. So people are in an onslaught of death and dying. There is disarray at the top about the messaging, about what our moral and our political position should be. And so then you continue to hear these stories about people just going out, 700 people at a party in New Jersey over the weekend, which is where I live. You hear those stories and you come to think people just don't care. But part of what I think folks, my more generous read is that people don't have the capacity to care, because to dig in and to really think about what's happening is for it all to hurt too much to care. And so folks just sort of resist that, right? And then many people are acting in ways that are reckless and that prolong this politics of death. And some of the logic that informs that is this necropolitical logic that says that we can risk it because we're young, or we can risk it because we're white, or we can risk it because our part of the country hasn't been hit hard yet. And all of that basically says that there are certain groups of people, because of their vulnerability, that it's just their cross to bear, or that they can just go ahead and die, but we're going to be okay and we're going to do for self. And so all of that is a kind of necropolitical logic about certain populations having value. And the last example of that is when months ago, the lieutenant governor of Texas literally gives this speech and he says, oh yeah, because, the elderly would, willingly, sacrifice their lives if we could go ahead and get the economy reopened, which is rooted in the idea that elders have no value, right? That they are a population whose lives are expendable. Anytime white people are talking about laying down their life for something, we should all take notice, because if you're, deciding that certain groups are expendable for capital, then that is the most perverse form of kind of necropolitical logic meeting a kind of neoliberal impulse in an era of nihilistic thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that very good overview. And I'm going to actually pitch it to Dr. Price with her political science background, and ask if you would be interested or have any thoughts on expounding upon that. And one question kind of comes to mind is this whole idea of how, as I was talking about earlier, where is this concept also embedded in our political discourse in a broader way, and sometimes even in our laws? And I know that your sister isn't here.
She's not.
The legal scholar, but if you would actually share to talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the things that we know is that everything that Brittany has talked about really is sort of once you start to frame this as an ethos, and then the next step, of course, to that is to set up the rules and ways that promote the results that you want, right? And so when we think about the ways in which COVID-19 in particular, the rules have been set up, right? They then say, we make the rules based on who are the people that we value and who must be taken care of, right? So all of a sudden, people whose jobs we never cared about have now been framed as essential workers, right? So most people walk in and out of grocery stores, they don't think twice about the person who's ringing them up or the person who is replenishing the shelves. Right. And now all of a sudden they are an essential worker. But when they become essential workers, we make no provisions for what it means to be an essential worker. Essential worker means that your job is so important that we're willing to expose you to potential death, right, but so meaningless that we won't put any kinds of policies, we won't make any kinds of legislation or implement any rules that will actually make it safer for you, right? And so, I think the nakedness of that kind of discrimination has been seen so much over the last few months, right? And think about the ways in which, we value nurses and we tell them they're our heroes and all of this other stuff in this
Right.
moment. But instead, look at what people are actually doing for them. There's no laws that say, now that we know that grocery store workers are essential workers, then what we should do is ensure that they have a living wage. Now that we know that nurses are essential workers, we should make sure that they have the proper equipment. And nurses are dear to my heart because there's a lot of nurses in my family. So we should make sure that they have the proper equipment. We instead say, you are essential, so you cannot stop working. When the world shuts down, you cannot shut down. But we also aren't going to do anything that's going to protect you from also dying of this disease. And that's the way that we see necropolitics as an ethos turn into the actual rules of the game, right? And I think it is incumbent upon sometimes I think some of us are for the first time thinking about, say, I keep coming back to grocery stores because it's one of the few places that people give themselves leeways to go. And I think for some people, it wasn't until they put that shield up at the grocery store that it ever occurred to them that they might be infecting people who work in the grocery store. Think about how many times we have headed out to the grocery store with the flu in the middle of the night seeking soup and ginger ale and stuff like that. And we just lean all over their stuff. We touch all over their stuff. We talk crazy to them loudly. And we now know that talking loud to people gives you is an extra way that you can infect people. And we do all of these things to them, but we don't, and we only think about it. Even when people were talking about essential workers, we were like, well, we don't want them to infect us. We want to go to the grocery store and we want to be safe. We want to be able to do the things in our lives and we want to be safe. The people whose job it is to clean up after us, good luck to them, right? I think that gets at what you're trying to say in the way in which we think about rules and the formation of rules. So for instance, in the state of Texas, which is where I am, you just quoted the lieutenant governor, but the governor, all of them have been deeply problematic around this issue. But one of the things that they've done is, so in the city of Houston, in our county, our mayor and our county government actually stepped up very early, shut everything down, did a very good job of it. But the governor comes in and then makes a rule that supersedes local government. And so now in the middle of this hotspot, they cannot shut down in the way that they had done before because the state government doesn't allow it. And so they see the cases rising. They see the number of people dying at home rising. They see all of these things happen, but now they can't do anything about it. All of the things they did in March and April are now things that are outside of their purview. And so in the moment when we need sensible leadership most, the power has been taken away from them. And I think it's also important, to talk about sort of the ways in which the rules of the healthcare system. And so it's not just that we don't have access to healthcare, it's also the stories about how many times Black people were sent home with the COVID virus, or how many times they have been told they needed to be tested, how many ways their humanity has been denied in this process, and the ways in which there is fear about going to emergency rooms and other places, not just because you're afraid that if you don't have COVID, you might catch it, but you're afraid that that actually might be the place where people will let you die because of who you are, because of what you look like, because of what they believe your comorbidities to be, because they look at you and they read your body in a particular kind of racialized way, and they say, this person vital, this person not. And that's if you're older, if you're Black, if you have high blood pressure, if you have any of the kinds of comorbidities that Black people tend to have, right? And so it's about not just the government, but it's the way healthcare decides how it doles out healthcare. It's the way in which we have trained doctors to see some people's lives as worth saving and others who are not valorous enough. It's the way in which we have educated police officers. It's in all of the rules where we say these people deserve life, and that life means second chances if they get stopped with drugs. That life means you actually get painkillers when you come to the emergency room because we believe you and we don't automatically assume that you're drug seeking. That life means that when you walk down the street in a neighborhood, you don't get stopped just because. That life means if you're like my fellow Prairie View alumni, Sandra Bland, if you ask the police to respect your rights, you don't end up in jail, and you don't end up in jail and not able to get out because your family can't cobble together $500, right? Those are the kinds of ways that we create these rules that lead us on a walk towards death way before our other racial counterparts. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Reverend Dr. Hendricks, actually, I just would like for you to talk a little bit about this concept again through the intersectional lens that you bring: politics, culture, theology. And actually, there's a question in the chat box which you might want to address as you talk about these. People do not have capacity to care. I think that was coming out of the nihilism that Dr. Cooper talked about. And he says, how can an incarnational theology that understands a transcendent God who suffers with his people be messaged to help understand the consequences of systemic neoliberalism and social responsibility without being dismissed in a polarized political culture? That's pretty layered but give your comments, and if you think you might be able to touch upon some of that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Andrea's questions are like thesis exams. They're like thesis exam questions. You're like,
that came out of the chat box.
I would, hopefully in the course of my remarks, I will address his very layered question. But you talk about the intersection of politics and theology. I'm a biblical scholar by training. I'm not a theologian, but I guess one might say I'm a biblical theologian in that regard, in that I try to anchor everything in the text and in the political economies in which the various texts were written. But I think that there's a term that just comes to mind. I've not seen it before, though it might have been used before, and that is necrotheology. And I raise this, and this might be a bit controversial, but so much of Christianity focuses on Jesus' death and resurrection. We talk about his blood. And so much of Paul is focused on Jesus' death and resurrection. And the cross is extremely, it's just foundational to our faith. But the problem with that is that focusing so much on his death and the subsequent events of the next few days takes so much focus away from the events and the teachings of his life. When Jesus said to follow him, he was speaking of to follow his teachings and his model and his example in life. We can't follow a resurrected Christ. He would not, there's no bridge from us from here to there. But we can follow, and we're called to follow the things that he taught and modeled in life. And so I find it, I'm being very careful with my wording here because this is a touchy subject, but I find it troubling that so many people preach, like Paul said, all he knew was Christ and him crucified. And so many Christians act the same way. Well, Paul apparently didn't have a lot of access to Jesus' teachings. We have almost no evidence of that in his writings. But we have evidence of his teachings through the remembrances of his disciples that were carried down through oral tradition and that were narrated and codified by the evangelists and others. And it seems to me that's where our focus should be. And to the extent that it's not, that allows the Christian church, for instance, that allows right-wing evangelicals to support a man who is a dedicated disciple of necropolitics, Donald Trump. They can do that because they're not focused on the teachings of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and the fact that the Hebrew Bible, that was the only Bible Jesus knew, that the foundational, the most important concept in that Bible is mishpat, it's justice. And it's egalitarian justice if you know, when you tie that to love your neighbor as yourself, you know, which of course is about one and the same, which is egalitarian. And so I think that much of Christianity is enamored with and in the thrall of necrotheology. People know more about Paul, who said he only knew Christ and him crucified. More of that than they know of what Jesus taught and what Jesus was about. So when we talk about an incarnational theology, incarnational politics, it's about, if you say that you're some kind of Christian, then start paying attention to what Jesus taught, and also put it in socio-political context, in the context of the political economy that he grew up in and he spoke to, and that his message spoke to. That would make a huge difference in the church. But I will say, because of the obsession with necropolitics, it would also make a huge exodus from the church, from many folks who don't come to the church looking to change the world, looking to have some semblance of God's kingdom of justice on earth. Many of whom come because so many of our pastoral colleagues are more concerned about changing the way people feel than transforming the world. Too many are concerned with emotionality, with no concept of what spirituality is about. It's almost as if they do not read, for instance, the 4th chapter of Luke, when Jesus, after he is baptized into his messiahship, that he doesn't get up and start preaching and shouting and jumping around and putting on a show. He goes out into the desert to prepare himself through meditation and contemplation and fasting, and silence and solitude, to prepare himself to make a difference in the world. So I guess let me just summarize it this way. An incarnational theology looks at Jesus as the full, total suffering man he was in the world, who saw the trauma that his people experienced, was wounded by that, and did his best to speak to it on every level, to speak to their physical deprivation, to their political oppression, to their psychological devaluation and depression. And if we keep that in mind, that is what is supposed to be fueling those who follow Jesus on this road, that would give us the kind of theology that would be life-giving and life-affirming and life-focused, and not spending so much time talking about supernatural things like, I'm covered in the blood of Jesus. He didn't even talk about that kind of stuff. So I'm gonna stop there because I'm getting a little carried away. I see Brittany smiling at me like, all right, man, that's enough. But
oh no, Brittany's here for all of it. Blow us up. We need it. I'm with you. Keep going.
Yeah, Brittany is some kind of preacher herself, I'll tell you that. But yeah, that's really what it comes down to. And we have to pay attention to what Jesus said and what he taught. That's it. And all this preacher is about, all this Paul stuff. I'm speaking as a professor, 25 years professor of biblical studies. Lay down Paul for a while, for a season, folks, please, and start preaching from the Gospels and pay attention to what's in the Gospels. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. As I said, this is to be a conversation. And what I'd really like now, if either of Dr. Price, Dr. Cooper, Dr. Hendricks, you've each had the opportunity to now hear kind of opening, intersecting conversation about one of the other's comments. So now just give you an opportunity, if you'd like, to expound or ask a question yourself. Or I know how it is when you're listening, stuff start kind of jumping off that you want to respond to.
No, I was listening to Dr. Hendricks. I mean, this is, look, Dr. Hendricks knows that I stand for him. I've just been so influenced by his work. And look, part of the reason that I wanted to think about, like, when I'm thinking about necropolitics and neoliberalism and nihilism, I'm thinking about those things in the context of the church. Necropolitics is all throughout the Bible, whether you're talking about the Old Testament, and the sort of slaughter of Hebrew boys, or you're talking about the New Testament and the same, Herod trying to kill all of these children. I mean, Jesus sort of grows up in a necropolitical context where he's always outrunning death, right? And that's the reason that so much of the story resonates with Black people. And because we understand that but look, part of the thing that we've got to figure out in the church is, are we going to continue to sort of make our theology about a sort of individual ethics around personal salvation, or are we going to actually stand up in this moment and use this moment to challenge the evils of empire? Because all that Trump is doing, see, part of the challenge, and this is what I took when I listened to Dr. Hendricks, part of the challenge of thinking that Jesus's life is primarily about his death is that logic also then translates to the way that white Christians treat Black people for their redemption. So what you then have in a political moment like that is somebody like Andy Stanley, right? Charles Stanley's son, coming out and saying, right after George Floyd is killed, you're going to do way more in death than you ever did for us in life, George Floyd. And that appalled me, because how dare this white man decide that Jesus's lot should be George Floyd's lot in a world where George Floyd doesn't get the benefit of resurrection, right? He dead, he in a grave, he gone, his life is stolen, and we don't get to mythologize him and say that he gets the triumphant return that Jesus Christ gets. But for white people, when their triumphalism is rooted in this idea, then they will worship at the altar of the dead Black body and then claim that it's been resurrected to redeem them, right? Because that's all about a project of redeeming white people's sins. But what do we do with the dead Black body upon whom that thing is staged, right? And so I'm tired of being part of the thing that I try to disrupt in my own thinking about what it means to be a church girl is, look, I love Easter. I am in the Baptist tradition in the Deep South, not the Southern Baptist tradition, but the Baptist tradition, Black Baptist tradition in the Deep South, right? National Baptist, you understand? And so I love and understand Easter. I like a good shout on a "he got up," but what do we do with the profusion of Black bodies who didn't get up? Breonna Taylor, dead in her bed, didn't get up. And I'm tired of a Black politics that only mobilizes when Black people get killed, because we also struggle, because so much of what we do is rooted in redeeming the lives of dead Black people. We don't fight as hard as we should to help living Black people to thrive, right? Through the kind of, and so that is a way that necropolitical calculations, we're always in a reactionary position. And part of what a conversation like today does is it invites us out of the reactionary position, right? And says that there are other things that have to motivate us besides death. And that and I think that that's the core of the Christian method, right? We're being led to the slaughter all day long, you understand? But that doesn't mean that we don't have a kind of impulse to fight for building the thing we want to see. And so death and the folks who are trying to kill us can't determine what it is that we're fighting for, because we're not just fighting to live, we're fighting for the quality of those lives to actually make a difference, right? We're fighting for people to actually live in a just context. And that means that we have to have a different orientation to the Bible. It means we have to have a different orientation of faith. And Black people absolutely have to have a different orientation of faith. Like, I'm tired of people treating Black women like Jesus. Y'all want us to sacrifice everything in order for everybody else to be well. Everybody wants to treat Black women like Jesus, and all that does is it kills us. And then, like I said, we don't get the benefit of resurrection, right?
Right.
Right.
And so I'm tired of that. And pointing out, and I love the term necrotheology, because it says to us that if we're not careful, that our theologies can be death-dealing structures just like our politics can. And that's why you see such easy alliances between the white evangelical right and Trump, because they all engage in a death-dealing project when it's not for white folks. And so they're very easy bedfellows. It actually ain't deeply contradictory when you begin to think about it.
Right. One of the things that I heard Stacey Abrams say that I think was really powerful, and it's if we as we are today remembering John Lewis, she said, we can't keep telling people died so you can vote, and now what we should be saying is you need to vote so people can live.
Oh,
That's great.
Yeah.
I think so coming up on the end, I want to piggyback on that sermonette that we just got. I feel very unfortunate that I'm the only reverend apparently not in the building today, but okay, I did that for my best friend over there.
She'll pay for it.
But but I think there's a way in which this necropolitics sometimes gets framed as noble sacrifice, right? That is, we are sacrificing for the good of people. But I can't remember which minister said it at St. Paul's in Philadelphia. Give them a shout out. But one of the ministers there, I remember we were having a conversation, and I remember them saying, Jesus died on the cross, so you don't have to.
That's right.
It wasn't that Jesus died on the cross so you could continually die, right? It's not like he was the first and we were just going to keep doing this forever. And so if you believe that the resurrected Christ was the person who was resurrected for everything, then why must so much of our theology be about how we are sacrificing our own lives in service to things that are not life-giving? And sometimes that looks like it's pretty innocuous, seemingly pretty innocuous, right? If you give me $1,000, I give it back to you sevenfold, and you make $1,200 a month, right? Sometimes that's working yourself to death in a church or in a religious institution that does not value or respect you, and then the day you die, they just move on to the next person they're willing to sacrifice. But sometimes that looks like in our own politics that is deeply tied. Black politics is deeply tied to Black religion, and we tell ourselves things like, in the middle of a pandemic, I must go out there to protest without masks, to protest in close proximity, because death is the thing that marks us more than the concern for my own life. And I'm not judging whether or not you do that, but that kind of calculation all comes into this notion of this kind of noble sacrifice, that to be a good person, to be a good Christian, is to give more of yourself than people deserve, than is healthy, than is even what Christ asks us to do, right? And so I think all of that is sort of getting around this connection that we have in churches and in the way we talk about theology, like this necrotheology thing. I'm gonna be thinking about this for a while now, because I think of the ways in which, for instance, people feel like one of the biggest troubles we've had in COVID-19 is the death of people around churches, right? And the people who have contracted the disease around churches, because they believe that if you are not in the building with other people, then you are not being a good Christian, even though Jesus didn't have buildings.
Right.
Talk. Come on.
Right?
Talk.
He didn't have a sanctuary. And he never said you need to be in this enclosed space with diseased people in order to follow me, right? And so even the way in which we have, when, by the way, one of the reasons they need you in those buildings is not because they need your worship, it's because they know if you don't come to those buildings, you ain't gonna get no offering, you ain't gonna pay no tithes, then they seem less useful. I mean, how are you useful if your flock ain't in front of you? It's like those kinds of questions are leading to whole churches actually sacrificing large numbers of their community. That's necrotheology, right? That's it.
May I say here, you're raising some very important point, and that is, and Brittany voiced it, and that has to do with the individualism. Individual ethos of Christianity is really blasphemy. It's a biblical blasphemy. And of course, we know that the tie to capitalism and certainly with neoliberalism. But there was a question that someone posed about Paul and Jesus. And you know, Paul had a different mission. I'm not putting Paul down, but Paul spoke out of a more individualistic Greco-Roman ethos. And he talked about individual salvation. Jesus didn't talk in individualistic terms. In Hebrew, there's not a term for an individual person. There's only I'm me, you know, people of my people, and what's so very, very, you know, the problematic about that is that we don't think in terms of the common good anymore. Now, if we were thinking about the common good and what is the just thing, then we'd be saying, well, yeah, I must, if I love my neighbor, I have to wear a mask to protect my neighbor. If I love my neighbor, and even if I don't believe that necessarily COVID will do it, I will not take a chance on having people come to my church when they might be hurt. In terms of politics, these folk aren't talking about the common good. They're not talking about justice. They're talking about just us. And this is the ethos, and it permeates the church. It permeates so much of classical theology. And I just want to stress again, I don't think this point is really seen in the church, even with all of the death we see mentioned throughout the Bible, and even death that the Bible seems to recommend at times, right? Mm-hmm. The ethical term that occurs most often in the Bible is mishpat, justice. It must be seen as the foundation of all the questions that we ask and all the prescriptions that we come up with. And again, it's egalitarian justice. You know, everyone's made in God's image, and everybody should have equal access to the tree of life. That means that we must talk about the common good at all times if we're to be people at faith. And that's what's not being talked about in this country, but even more so now with this sick demon in the White House. And you know, he had this woman talking about the hydro, whatever how you pronounce it, but you know, she must know a little about demonology because she's on his team. But you know, you have this, you have him. He has, you know, so distorted, so really destroyed this whole notion of a common good, even worse than it was before he got in. And so these are kinds of things we have to start thinking in terms of again, because COVID-19 would have never come anywhere near close to the damage that it's done if we have been thinking about the common good from the very beginning and preaching that, and it's still not talking about it. Still, with all the death that we're faced with, we've seen, and we're faced with, we're still not talking about what is best for the common good, just talking about what's best for this demon to continue on in the White House.
Sure, but the political scientist in me says this country, to be an American, this country is founded on the notion that the common good does not include everybody, right? I mean, I like to tell people all the time that the best thing about the founders and the best thing about the Constitution is that they were so arrogant in the writing of it that they didn't want to sound petty. They didn't want to talk about slavery. They didn't want to talk about how women didn't mean anything. They didn't want to talk about that stuff because it sounded petty. It was too much like the Twitter of our day, right? And so instead they used all these lofty terms. And then Black people were like, I'm going to take that arrogance and I'm going to make you eat it, right? That's how this is going to work. But Americanism as a religion runs up against Christianity so much because American life is about creating hierarchies of who is valuable and who is not. And if you are to be a true follower of Jesus, then you have to destroy those hierarchies. And that is why people often equate wrongly their Americanism to Christianity, right? That is, their patriotism is their true religion. And when Christianity fits up with that, then they're happy to do it. So they'll help pack groceries for the homeless. They won't figure out why people keep ending up homeless, right? They'll give money to charities. They'll give money to buy backpacks, at school time. They won't figure out how the Lord does not want children to have to come asking you for backpacks at the charity of your own individual will, and how we as a society should have a communal plan for how children get the things they need for school. But see, that's American patriotism, that individual notion that I got this because I worked hard for it. I got this because I deserve it. And now when you look at sort of all of those pastors who are running with Trump, they are the same people who don't just say, I got this as an American because I work hard, but they got this as a Christian. The Lord ordained the things they got because they're such good people, because they work so hard. God wants me to have a $6 million house while people are homeless. God wants me to drive a Bentley to church while the people in the parking lot took the bus to get there, right? It's all tied into the exact same ethos where they are convincing themselves both politically, both theologically, and in every other way that they can, that somehow they are blessed, right? It's not white privilege.
Oh, it's white blessings.
It's white blessings, right? We are lucky. And they want to pretend as if in moments like this, if we are not careful, they want to pretend as if this can be solved without them doing any sacrificing. Right? That this can be solved, like we can make more millionaires, they don't become not a millionaire. We can make more, excellent schools, they don't have to sacrifice the unfair amount of funding they get for their schools, right? That's the thing that they're trying to figure out in this moment. They're trying to figure out, what can I do to fix this racial problem that does not involve me losing a damn thing?
And let me jump in and add to that wonderful sermon that that part of that impulse, which this distinction that Dr. Hendricks keeps making between the Jesus who has a communal and public sense of this versus Paul, who is individualist, is why white religions and white theology, white politics, all worships at the altar of privatization. That's why they care about so it's your private salvation, it's your private church, it's your segregated school pod that you building right now with all the like-minded folks, and you don't care what happens to the kids of color in the community, the kids that's got disabilities, the troubled kids. You don't, because it's all about your private thing. It's all about, and so look, I've been saying for a while, part of what happens and part of why I be yelling about neoliberalism, because it's another way to say privatization, that we get everything because we work hard, because we earn it, because we self-actualize. Look, that stuff has infiltrated the Black church, which is why we all just basically putting soul on white Christian music now, and then and even though the theology doesn't fit our own sort of worship style or needs, but it's because even in the evangelical Black church, we have bought into the idea that doing theology the way that white people do it will give us access to white blessings. So we look at the way that white people get white blessings and we say it must be because they following God's rules better than we are. So if we buy their ideas about tithes, even though we don't have nothing like their wages, and if we buy their ideas about nuclear families and heterosexuality, even though their marriages are breaking up just as bad as everybody else's and their children are incorrigible and terrible just as like everybody else's, that if we do it, then our lives can have that middle class gloss of security like white folks have, and all of that. And white folks have managed to float that thinking by first making us believe that our whole relationship with God is about individual salvation. And then you can go out in the world and impose that individualism on everything else. So you don't have to think about how to make schools better for all kids. You just want the Lord to give you more money so you can put your kid in a private school, right? Even though you leave in the community to languish, right? but also part of what that means is that then we have structurally maligned what we mean when we say public. So every time somebody hears public assistance, public welfare, public housing, all they think about is Black women who don't deserve to be there. That's literally who you conjure. I say welfare queen, I say public housing. Who do you see? You don't see no white person. You see a Black person, and depending on the part of the country, you might see a brown person. But that's why white folks are able to structurally malign all things public and say that they are lesser than, that they're less worthy of investment, that they don't have any, that they don't have any responsibility to the common good, or what I call the public good, right? This is why. So look, here's what that looks like in this immediate moment. Trump is destroying the post office. Now, we know that there's been an attack on the post office by the GOP for more than a decade because they want to privatize it, because again, they think privatization is God. But so we're missing in this moment that they're messing with the post office so that basically we're going to have to risk our lives in order to go out and vote, because they're going to mess with the structural integrity of the vote. But to make this only about to vote, the vote is to miss the full-scale attack on public life. And that's why then you see Trump not having any commitment to a full national strategy, because these are men who don't believe in public good at all. So they don't believe that you should provide that what is the role of government then? Even small government conservatives think government should manage pandemics. And they have but you see, when you begin to erode the moral basis for a public good, then you can have white Christians getting on board with a privatization scheme that is diametrically opposed to everything that I read about in the Bible, that has no sense. Even if you talk about the Acts 2 church, it's a collective project, right? There's not this sense that that power should be wielded individually. It's always to be wielded collectively. But that is what a private theology centered on Paul in his project and not Jesus in his project ultimately gets you. And what I lament, look, in the end, I think white folks are doing what they're doing. And I don't know what kind of theology is going to save y'all. You know, because the debt to me feels too high to pay. And that's probably why y'all relying on Jesus's blood. But I am worried about what Black people are going to do, because we're worshiping at the altar of that stuff. We're trying to turn our mega churches into clones of white mega churches. We read all y'all's literature. And when I talk to the Black folks that I used to go to church with, not at my progressive Baptist church now, they don't even read Black theologians. Half of them ain't never read Oprah Hendricks, but they can run you down all of these white theologians because they don't even have the sense that the white theological project is rooted in shoring up a version of the world that is about helping white people to win, right? And about a metaphysics, about a theology that affirms what white people understand and think is true about the world. They can't even see that. And so they don't even have any so they would be have their feathers just as ruffled if they heard Dr. Hendricks say, lay Paul down, as some of the folks in the chat were, right? Because for them, part of what they're relying on is that individual salvation helps me to escape the perils that racism, sexism, and capitalism would otherwise enact on me.
And so here's what's so perverse. Go ahead. Here's what's so perverse about that, though. All of this notion of what's bad about public. If you look at the vast majority of white people who are in the middle class right now, the vast majority of white people who have inherited generational wealth, they got it all from public goods. They got it all from public education. They got it from the GI Bill that gave them free college and free access to home loans. And they went to the VA for their health care. They got it all from public goods. But somehow now that they can afford to pay for those other things, they're saying to hell with everybody else. And that's to hell with poor white people who don't seem to understand this at all. That's to hell with people who don't speak English. That's to hell with people who are too brown. That's to hell with a lot of people. When in the end, you can trace their wealth. I have friends who I can say, you bought your house because your grandfather got the GI Bill and went to college and became a doctor, when my grandfather couldn't get any of that, right? And so all of it is sort of a perverse understanding of merit. It's a perverse understanding of public. It's a perverse understanding of who they actually are in the world. And so part of this thing that we're having to do in this moment, and part of the reason why Trump resonates with these people is because he tells himself the same lie.
Talk.
Yeah.
Right?
Man, you know, this is a very important thing because there's something that I've been a critic of the church about for quite some time, of preachers actually. And that is a term that has been spoken here, but that you very seldom hear any preachers talk about. And I'm talking about the biggest talking heads, supposed leaders, and that is capitalism. They don't look at the role of capitalism and how much of the things we're talking about are creatures of capitalism, like, you know, the whole fiction about the nuclear family is what's so important. The extended family is the norm throughout most of human history, right? But not only that, when we start nuclearizing the family, for instance, or bifurcating various neighborhoods, we are in service to the kind of individual ethos that capitalism thrives off of. And so many of our churches replicate the capitalist model. Capitalism and Christianity, as Jesus taught it, are not compatible. And we need to start critiquing, even if it's not from a theological standpoint, but from a basic standpoint of political economy. We must start critiquing capitalism, its forces, its instantiations in our communities, because speaking of COVID-19, that would help us understand, you know, a lot more of the forces. We're going to get a deeper understanding of the forces that have so many Black people dying, have so many people, period, dying. But we're seeing now, little by little, well, we're not hearing as much since Bernie Sanders faded back into the woodwork, so to speak. But we're seeing these critiques of socialism, and people don't even know what socialism is, which are really valorizations in reverse of capitalism. They just won't call its name. The major capitalists won't call its name. Our politicians won't call its name. We must start critiquing this from a perspective of political economy, so our people understand the forces that are trashing their lives. And in my seminary classes, and even in I teach it. I'm a visiting professor at Union now, thank God. I teach at Columbia though. But in my classes, I always try to raise up for these aspiring preachers that you must have the tools of analysis to understand the political economy. And the reason I'm pushing this is because, as all of us on the panel know, that's our major problem right now. We do not understand what's going on in the political economy, how we can change it. And our preachers, Lord have mercy, they are pitiful. They have very little idea what's going on. It's not always their fault, because very few seminaries are teaching this stuff. But you know, those of us who know, we must preach that part of the gospel too.
Okay. Wow, this is great. There are a couple of comments I want to make sure we address the people who have questions, but also, and then we'll ask you guys to do kind of a summary and overview. NCC, as you know, we have 38 communions, denominations, as some would call, that run the spectrum of our historically white denominations, some historically Black mainline denominations. We have Orthodox communities, what we call peace churches. So it's a very broad umbrella. And in 2018, on the anniversary of Dr. King's martyrdom, we launched what we called our Act Now initiative, Awaken, Confront, and Transform to End Racism Now. And part of that work is truth telling within the church. And one of the things about even this conversation about now, as you say, necrotheology, which, as you said, that's going to keep us awake at night too, and the necropolitics. Some of us went to Ghana last year, the year of return, 400 years after the first ship of enslaved persons coming from what's now Angola landed at Point Comfort in Virginia. But while there, one of the things that I couldn't shake is smack dab in the middle, the center of each of the dungeons quote unquote, slave castles.
Or on top of some of them.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, smack, like I said, in the middle of it is the church, is a church. And so there's so much work to be done. And even as, and I appreciate this conversation, there has been challenge to quote unquote, white people as a people, white church as a church, Black people, Black churches, as to how we're gonna have this conversation. The thing that's really challenging for me and for us is having this conversation. We've got to get to some truth. And when I thought about this concept that brought us to this table was, if we don't begin to deal with the real truth of our history, and how there's been this systemic and systematic diminishing of some humans. Dr. Price, I really like the idea, like you said, when the founders were founding this country, they knew who they were eliminating, but they just didn't say it. Yeah. But because they didn't say it, and even if they, what's really sad, had they said it, we would have been like, well, the founders said, you really can just kill people if you don't like them. And that would have been acceptable in the laws.
Well, the thing about it is it would be harder to, they wouldn't be, the reason why they're lionized now is because they can actually say Thomas Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are equal. We know that he really meant men who are white with property, some level of education and standing, right? And so when you hear that, you're like, look, Thomas Jefferson was awesome. Then you're like, hold on, let me offer some other pieces of information about that to you, right? And I think that part of this whole project, part of the difficulty, I think, in having true racial discussions is I found, having taught at PWIs for a very long time, that Black people, people of color in general, talk about race a lot, incessantly, all the time, at the McDonald's, at church, at home. They think about it just getting up in the morning, right? But there's a way in which whiteness offers the luxury of not being able to do that. Yeah. And also, the thing that I have always found so interesting is when I ask my white students how much time they've spent as the minority, the racial minority, like the numerical minority in a space, the answer is not very much.
Right.
So they haven't had to figure out what it feels like to be the odd person out in a particular situation. They haven't had to figure out how they're going to adjust themselves to the space that they're in, how to read the room. They haven't had to figure out who are the people in here who are racist, who are the people who are potential enemies, who are the people in here who are benign, who are the people in here I have to listen to. They haven't done that kind of racial work. They haven't done that kind of mental work. And so you have to get white people prepared for the amount of discomfort that they're going to feel, that the rest of us have been feeling since time immemorial, right? One of the things that I argue in discussions about Barack Obama is that Barack Obama never really said anything that should have made white people that uncomfortable with their standing in life, right? He never said, I'm gonna blow up all the white stuff. He never said, I'm gonna send white people to concentration camps. He never said any of the things that people imagined he was saying. But it was just having to see that Black person in a place of leadership. They had to constantly reorient themselves. Oh, right, he's Black, I'm white. Oh, right, he's Black, I'm white. And it's an exercise that they never have to do. Although all the time, Black people are like, all right, this doctor is white. Am I gonna have to explain to him about how Black people have these issues. All right, this teacher is white. Am I going to have to explain to them how my son, who is a little bit fidgety, is not does not need ADD meds? All right, this part, like, you spend your whole life trying to figure out what things you're going to have to tell people in order to make your humanity more visible to them. And so there is a way in which white people have so much work to do, but it's almost impossible because they don't want to feel uncomfortable. And more importantly, no, they don't want to feel uncomfortable at church. They didn't come there for that.
Yeah.
They didn't come to church to struggle. Jesus struggled. They're not going to do it. And so if you then have to walk through this process with them, if you have to walk through upending racial privilege, if you have to walk through being honest, if you have to walk through and kill the giants of their history and their theology, Thomas Jefferson has to come off the pedestal, right? I don't know no white theology people, but whoever that is who they love, who was a racist, has to come off of the pedestal. And then you have to start having real conversations. And that is hard, but you're gonna have to do it if you are truly committed to actually ending these racial disparities, if you are truly committed to the people who are people of color who you say you love having the same outcomes as you. If you're committed to that, then you're gonna have a lot of discomfort. I mean, Black people, are we comfortable yet in this country? I see you could at least take, and what we have found in American politics and in American history is that this window that's open right now has happened before. And they have a good 5 years. I'm telling you, if you're fundraising now for Black stuff, if you're fundraising now for people of color, you need to get as much as you can. You need to make sure it's multi-year commitments because they're going to lose patience with this. And at some point, they're going to want this to go back to normal. And so now we are relitigating things that we have litigated over and over and over again. Not because Black people dropped the ball like we tend to think, not because our grandparents were too soft and they didn't believe, not because people don't understand the problem, but because at some point, white people who hold much of the power in their hands, they get tired of it and they want to go back to the life that feels good to them. And what the thing that I always say is, well, I want my people to feel some of that goodness too, right?
So let me jump in and just add as a closing thought for me, what Dr. Price made me think about is, so then what does that mean for the preacher or the spiritual leader of the church, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I think two things, one hyper pragmatic, but one more general. Mm-hmm. What Dr. Price is talking about is, so Robin DiAngelo calls it racial stamina, and she says white people have none. This self-help guru that I follow, who's also an actress, Tina Lifford, she has this concept that I like called inner fitness or spiritual fitness, right? Because we think a lot about outer fit, training your body, right? But inner fitness is literally, inner fitness plus racial stamina means that as spiritual leaders, you actually need to walk through with white people, helping them to cultivate the discipline of being able to hear uncomfortable shit and being able to sit in it. Like, if Christianity is a confessional religion, and the way that I learned that you always had to confess all your sins before Jesus would listen to you in the first place. I don't practice it in that way anymore, but we have, even in some of the more traditional ways that we teach, the tools to help people to begin to understand a kind of confessional life. Please don't go around confessing to Black people. We already know you're
no. We don't want it.
I don't. In fact, that's the thing you could do for me today. Please don't come to me for absolution. I don't have none to give you. I don't have no patience for it. I don't want to hear it. Tell it to Jesus, who has the blood that will save you. Right. But that doesn't mean that in the white church, your job is to help people cultivate the disciplines around, so that maybe in 5 years, if the church does its job, maybe in 5 years, people won't be tired, because what spiritual leaders have done is actually dug into the souls of white folks, to quote Du Bois, and said, what kind of work do we need to do to build the spiritual stamina so that they can actually hear these uncomfortable messages and think about their relationship to power? And look, part of the reason that I know white folks are feeling real uncomfortable on this call right now, like, because your people are impossible. They are impossible. And that impossibility comes from always having so much power that even the thought of losing it's why billionaires need more billions, because if you had 10 billion this week and five next week, then you feel like you've lost a substantial amount of power when you still have more money than you will ever spend in your lifetime, right? Because too much power skews your sense of perspective, capacity, justice, all those things. The other reason that white people are scared is because y'all like, but am I gonna lose my pastor job and get locked out of my church when I start to challenge these stone-faced folks? Very probably. I mean, whiteness is evil, and it is mostly I didn't call white people evil. Whiteness as a theological and political and ideological project is evil because it cares about power more than almost anything else. And when you stand up and you begin to challenge it, I mean, look, we are people who follow a man who was God himself and then got crucified anyway. Like, this is what we signed up for. I would like white people to sign up for it more than black people have, though, because we've done our share of being hung on the cross. Y'all haven't done your share of that. And Jesus already said to us that this was the cost of challenging empire. The cost of standing up to empire and saying that there was a better way to do it is that they might kill you. And I think that part of the challenge is that as long as you are not willing, white people are not going to learn how deeply rooted whiteness is until you start trying to challenge that stuff among other white people. And the minute you begin to have those questions, then you're going to realize how deeply white people don't even know how invested they are in whiteness until they're asked to challenge it and let it go. And then you're asked to challenge other white people to let it go. And the kind of terrible stuff they will begin to do to you in a way to maintain their own power and comfort. You also got to build your own inner fitness to be able to handle that, right? So that's my general and the Bible verse the Bible chapter I've been meditating on when I read my Bible, because a lot of times I just look at the Lord. As a Black Christian, I just look at the Lord and be like, well, where's your justice, Lord? Because I mean, they just killing my people. And Trump just does every manner of evil thing and ain't no justice come to him. And if you give him justice at some point later in life, what that's going to do right now in these 8 years is he's raining hell down upon people who look like me, right? So I want to be clear that we even talking about this from two different, my prayers are very different from yours, right? Because I'm trying to understand how the God that I love, who I learned is a God of justice, allows this thing to happen when my people didn't get in the voting booth and vote for Trump. White people did that. Right. And so where's the God of justice for Black folks? Right. We are faithful. We are still more outsized in terms of religion, more disproportionately represented. So imagine what it means to be a Black person and have to go to the Lord over and over and over again and cry out for God to help and basically see white Jesus winning every day. Right. So I just want to offer that is typically my lament. But to the extent that the church has a responsibility, that is what you can do. And when I do open my Bible, I think about Isaiah 59, where the imagery there is, I forget the verses right off top, but I wrote about it some months ago. The imagery there, it says truth staggers in the street, right? Like it's been in a boxing match and it's just over on the sidelines, kind of, it's had the hell knocked out, like the wind has been knocked out of it. I mean, the hell has been beaten out of the truth, right? And so it is out here fighting the battle for its life, and it ain't winning right now. And to me, that imagery is really powerful. And so I would say, if you really want to knock a blow to the politics of trying to take the truth down, start preaching against Fox News' talking points. That's my very pragmatic suggestion. I want to say that I actually think that the critical difference in this political moment and some other eras that we've been in is that the right they have polished and they have been sophisticated in launching a propaganda machine that we have not seen before. This is why these conversations have been harder in this moment than they've ever been, because they have the whole power of sort of like a state television apparatus. Most people in America who watch the news watch Fox News. MSNBC's ratings, CNN's ratings, any other major news outlets' ratings don't compete with Fox News's ratings in prime time, which is a prime propaganda machine. And that means that in white churches, that's who the majority of your parishioners are watching. That is who is framing their view of reality. And so you got to start preaching against some of that stuff. You got to start giving people the political tools, the analysis to be able to critique the stuff that they're hearing. Because when I sometimes just go to Fox News and see what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a totally different world. And I know that that seems like a weird place to go, but it's a thing I think about a lot, because I think the way that Trump has been so successful is that he's won the information wars. The church and our society is losing the information wars. The sort of disarray that we have about COVID suggests that our people are all struggling to know what the truth is, who to trust, what authorities to trust, what kind of rules and tools they need to be able to discern which way to go. And so Trump is successful because he creates a sense of chaos about what are the things that we know. But there is actually also a place where that chaos disseminates from, and much of it is from Fox and the conservative news ecosystem that has been built up around it. And so you got to start working with your children, your young people, and even with some of your elders to disrupt the universe of possibility that thing creates. It creates anxiety for people. It skews their sense of where the threat actually is. It valorizes Trump. It takes away people's sense of what all is going on in the world. And the Bible says the church is the pillar and ground of truth. And that means that has to be one of our battlegrounds. What are we telling people the truth is? You got to stand up and say, he's a lie and the truth ain't in him. Fox News is 90% lies. The truth ain't in it. And it's skewing your view of what we should be doing. And so you don't have to stand up and name Fox News, but you ought to be keeping account of what kind of narrative they are generating. And you ought to be figuring out how you're going to preach against that narrative, because when we can crack that narrative, then we might actually have a little bit of room for people to begin to hear another story about what's going on and why Trump is so problematic. Yes. Yes.
No, I appreciate that. I just like to say, I hear what you're saying, and I'm glad. I have to say that though, I don't ask those questions of the Lord, because I know I'm not going to get any answers. Number one, what I do is I try to focus on the ethical foundation, the ethical unction, if I might be a little churchy, that we're given. And as I read through what is our foundation, the foundation of Jesus, the Hebrew Bible, there are four primary ethics that I try to uphold in all my work. My written work, all my sermons, and probably do it less successfully in my life. But there are four. The first is mishpat. I've mentioned that. Justice. The second is sadaqah, translated as righteousness, really means doing right, putting justice in action. And interestingly, mishpat and sadaqah are the terms that show up most often in the Hebrew Bible, but they're also the most often paired terms, which we could translate as social justice, but I won't get into that. It's in my next book coming out. And then we have chesed, sort of steadfast love or prismatic love, the way we approach the world. And then the last would be truth. And those are four basic, in fact, those were Martin Luther King's four basic ethics. And so what I'm saying essentially is, think if we identify the ethical foundations for our moving forward, we can even bring non-believers along, because we're talking about an ethical vision. Because on the other hand, for me, and this is only for me, not a criticism of anyone, but for me, calling out to the Lord is just causes too much despair for me in this moment, because so much is going on, and and you're wondering, like, Lord, why is evil given such reign in these days? Why is neoliberalism getting wings? Why are we in this neoliberal moment, in this capitalist cocoon, in which we know that capitalism was built by people, so it can't last forever, but we see no way out of it. All that I know to do is to take those foundational ethical beliefs and move forward and struggle. And that's sort of what I get from John Lewis as well. All we can, and I know that you all agree, and I know Brittany degree. She's a full-time soldier. All we can do is struggle. And I don't expect, and none of us expect to see any real justice in our lifetime, But even though I'm 39 years old, I have a great granddaughter now. Yeah, I wish I was 39, but I have a great granddaughter now. And maybe something that you and I do can make a difference, for her generation. And I don't want to sound like I don't believe in God and I call on God, but I don't believe that God's going to deliver us. I believe we're just going to have to deliver ourselves with the tools he gives us. And that's why I commend the sisters on this panel, because I'm very proud of the work that you all and all my colleagues on this call are doing in trying to make contributions to the fight for justice in your own fields. And it makes a huge difference. And, not all of us have our newest books on the bookshelf behind us.
A friend of mine told me to do that.
I wish somebody had told me to do that, right?
Now, every time, right there.
Yes, there you go. But yeah, but this is where we are, I think. And I think that's how we can persevere. We'll get through this COVID thing. Some of us are going to fall by the wayside, but we have to take some lessons from this. And the lessons are that we are in a moment of a spirit of Antichrist. I'm not talking about some metaphysical supernatural person. I'm talking about, 1 John talks, a spirit of Antichrist, meaning those who teach the opposite of what Christ taught in the name of Christ. And we have to realize we're in this spirit of Antichrist that embraces capitalism or vice versa, and fight it that way, and fight it with truth, and fighting fighting those of us who are believers, fighting it with the truth of what Jesus taught, which means getting hip to what it really was and get past, all the foolishness, and then move forward that way. As I said hip, I'm doubting myself, I'm dating myself, but
Oh, that's what 39-year-olds say all the time.
That's true. That's true. We 39-year-olds,
No, I'm not 30. I'm clearly 47, so I don't know what they say.
I mean, we say
Can I say in the way of something like
celebrated an anniversary of my 21st birthday a couple of days ago. So, but
hey, can I say one thing before we? I saw in the question and answer somebody asked a question about hearts and minds, and I think it's interesting because that this is done in a religious context, because mostly I tell my students I don't care about hearts and minds. I'm like, set up the rules, set up the things that are fair. But the thing that I want to say is that sometimes the changing of hearts and minds is in doing a different thing, right? Sometimes you feel uncomfortable doing a thing, but you do it and then it feels right, right? And that's the only way that this is going to change. And the only way we come out of this moment better than where we are now is if people do things that are different and that feel uncomfortable, but that support the vision of the world they claim they want to live in. Justice is what I like how Cornel West says justice is what love looks like, in action. Or love is what, anyway, you get my point. You get my point. But I know Cornel West loves to say it. He says it a lot. So I love when he says that, because I think the thing, that there's something true about that. And politics is a muscle. Religion is a muscle. Being just is a muscle. And the muscle memory means that even when you're tired, even when you're exhausted, your muscles know the right thing to do. And being anti-racist is a muscle. Being non-homophobic, not being transphobic, all of those things are muscles. You have to practice them. And so what you can do is start to practice it in your own life with your own children. And then everywhere you meet it in public, you say, oh no, that's not how I do this thing. Oh no. Because all of us in our own lives have had to stop people in their tracks who are making assumptions about, they'll be saying, oh, we believe. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not in that we. You need to start making clear which we's you're in and which ones you are not. And if we start to do that, then hearts and minds will change. But you don't change the heart always first.
Right.
And then wait for the action. Sometimes you start doing that. Anybody who's ever run a marathon will tell you, I've never done that. But I imagine that when you do it at the beginning, nobody thinks they can do it. And then you have to go. And I say marathon and not sprint because this is a very long process. We have learned this over time, and it requires very hard work. And when you feel bad about it, when you feel like you can't do it anymore, you take a break and then you start doing it again. And the thing that should make you start doing it again, I have this little plaque in my office that I love that says, sometimes I get so tired and then I remember what Harriet Tubman did for a living. Tell yourself that when you sometimes I get so tired and then I think about what happened to George Floyd. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I would only conclude with, I tell people all the time when I do the work that I do here on the Hill, when I enter into the offices, and this is about where we are positioned in history. I always start with, well, what we want, we're going in to ask about this bill or that bill. And I say, you know, what we're looking for is the beloved community on earth it is in heaven. And then we negotiate down from there. And so if we always look for
I love that
greatest vision, the greatest manifestation of what justice is in our daily life, we're not going to get it that day. But if we envision it and we try to live out what it means to get one step further to it, then that is our responsibility. Yes. So I thank you all so much.
Thank you.
This was fun. Thank you.
And when we get out of these, we're on the COVID days, maybe the next one we'll have to do, and we'll do, you know, with some wine. And I did that out loud on the computer and all that good stuff. But thank you all for joining us, those who joined and were able to be with us. This is going to be available for others to look at later if they so choose. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
And thank
Bye-bye.
you, sisters.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. That was fantastic.